Today on Sagittarian Matters, we are talking about the connections between TERFs and fascism, plus the word dyke, with special guest Greta LaFleur. Stay tuned.
Sagittarian Matters, Sagittarian Matters, what's the matter with you? Sagittarian Matters.
Hello from the Sagittarian Matters social distancing studios in Tahunga, California. Listeners, I have just returned from a meditation retreat, and so I do not have the level of ranting and raving in my soul that I sometimes do, but I did want to tell you a few things before we started the show. Number one, there is a chipmunk in my yard. It is a solo chipmunk. I haven't seen any chipmunk friends. You know, it's either Chip or Dale Rescue Ranger, but it's just one of them. Is he wearing a trench coat and a Sherlock hat? He is. But he is really utilizing all of the house-shaped bird feeders that I have. He will go into the little house, look at me through the windows, look at me through the door, stick his tail out the door. Sometimes when he can tell I'm watching him, he will pause wherever he is and start swaying his tail back and forth. It's kind of like when you see a beauty pageant queen on a float and she has her little cupped hand and she's just moving her arm back and forth from the elbow. That's what his tail is doing. It's a sway. It's not kind of a, like it's not a squirrel tail. It's a swaying tail. Anyway, I'm really enjoying watching him. I'm sorry I'm freaking him out by watching him, but I'm really just sitting behind my desk and I moved my head. In other news, I'm actively editing my 500-page diary comic anthology that's coming out this year with Phase 8 Publishing. Stay tuned. I will let you know how to order it the minute I have that information. And I'm also going to be hitting the comics scene. If you would like a review copy, if you are a reviewer for some kind of publication or website or podcast, let me know. You can contact me through the Sagittarian Matters Instagram page, which is Sagittarian Matters. Lastly, but not least, I wanted to tell you I'm doing a reading this Friday, March 24th at Heavy Manners Library in Los Angeles, California. You can get more information and you can get tickets at, I guess you should just Google Heavy Manners Library. How about that? Okay. I hope that you enjoy my talk with Greta LaFleur. I could not find the episode that we were both referencing, but I did talk to Greta for my other podcast, The Gay-Mazing Race, with Karen Tongson, and also Greta's best friend Palomi was on with her. So go find that if you want to hear more. In the meantime, enjoy the show. Greta LaFleur is an associate professor of American Studies at Yale University and the author or editor of 3 books and 3 journal special issues, including the new issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly, Exclusionary Feminisms and the Global New Right, which was co-edited with Serena Bassi. You can get this special issue right now from dukeupress.edu. But in the meantime, please enjoy my talk with friend to the show, Greta LaFleur. Greta LaFleur, welcome to Sagittarian Matters.
I'm very happy to be here as ever.
Have you been on the show before?
You know, I thought we maybe had. Am I making this up?
You were on the Gay-Mazing Race.
I wasn't. Maybe I'm thinking of the Gay-Mazing Race. Yes.
But I feel like you have been on Sagittarian Matters.
I also
before.
feel like I've been on Sagittarian Matters before, but I don't remember what we were talking about. But
me neither. Welcome back.
And kudos to you on the longevity of your show.
Thank you. It was obviously so long ago.
Yeah.
That we don't recall.
Speaks to like the endurance of the program.
But we did Zoom before when I was working on that gender book for kids with Judith Butler. And I was like, Greta, give me a primer on Judith Butler. Gender theory. And I still owe you a portrait of your dog that I was going to do in exchange your dog, Marge. But it was very helpful.
Okay. Well, I'm glad. And it's funny because now we're talking about gender theory again, just in a different way.
We're talking about gender theory again in a different way. Okay. So, where do I begin? Hold on. I'm doing a deep scroll and that's where I begin. So you co-wrote the introduction to an issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly about TERFs
Gender Critical Movements and Post-Fascist Feminisms, and you co-wrote it with Serena Bassi.
Yeah.
So I wanted to have you come on the show because I have been really, obviously maddened by TERFs, and I'm a person on Twitter, and so sometimes I can't tell what's real and what's just on Twitter.
Absolutely.
And maybe Twitter's real, but maybe Twitter's not real.
Yeah, it's hard to know with Twitter. It's hard to know. Maybe it's going to happen. Maybe it's collapsing. Maybe what's happening on it is true. Maybe it's not. Yeah.
Because, you and I are in a similar circle of radical queer people of a certain age. And so it almost feels like TERFs are like a figment of people's imagination, or maybe just J.K. Rowling. I don't know, but then they're actually quite real. And so I wanted to talk to you about the connection between TERFs and fascism.
Yes.
When I was so excited to see that you were writing about this and thinking about this. So I guess I wanted to ask you, just in real plain basic terms, for anyone who's just tuning in being like, well, what's that? What's a TERF? How would you define a TERF?
Okay, so the easiest way is, so think about TERF. TERF is an acronym. So TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And TERF as a term, I actually know that someone has written an article on where the term actually comes from, and I'm blanking on the actual origination of the word, but it's a word that I started hearing tossed around in probably the late 90s, a lot in the early 2000s. And it basically describes a phenomenon, and I think it's a useful word because it describes a phenomenon wherein you have really feminist identified people, right? Like people and movements that actively identify as feminists, that organized around feminist issues, that pay attention to things like gender-based hierarchy and gender-based violence, so that you're oh yeah, I can get on board with that. But the big distinguishing factor between just general feminists, I mean, I don't actually know if there's anything that unites all feminists, which I'm happy to talk about later, but what makes TERF specific is that they understand women, or the term woman, to only mean cisgender women. So for lack of a better word, for lack of a better phrase, people who are assigned female at birth. I don't usually use that, but in here it's a little bit useful to sort of use that phrase.
Yeah. And are they this new kind of batch, or the way we're recognizing these people now and thinking about Twitter, are they the same people from second wave feminism? Are they new people? Do they have anything in common?
Yeah. So yes. So that's another great question. And so the answer is yes and no, really. So there is a long-standing trans exclusionary radical feminist TERF movement in the US, in Canada, in England. There's a kind of Anglophone, there's a belt of Anglophone feminists that I think have sort of through which TERF ideology kind of spread, starting in the 70s and sort of moving forward to our own moment. And some of those people are still around writing. There's people Sheila Jeffries or Janice Raymond, who are probably some of the loudest TERFs that I know of, or loudest TERFs before the internet, I guess I should say. But then now what we're also seeing is a movement of people who would not call to themselves TERFs, although TERFs also don't refer to themselves as TERFs, and many TERFs understand TERF, the word TERF or the acronym TERF, to be a slur, which I think is silly because it's descriptive. Do you know what I mean? They are trans exclusionary radical feminists. They identify as radical feminists, but they don't understand trans women as women. They're trans exclusionary, so they're TERFs. I don't think it's a slur, it's just a description. But they don't like being called that because it sort of shows their exclusionary principles and sort of foregrounds their exclusionary principles. So alongside TERFs, there's another sort of kind of related set of movements that sort of travel under the moniker of gender critical feminists. So I wouldn't say that gender critical feminists have are entirely overlap with TERFs. I would say TERFs often, not always, but often tend to be more involved in queer and lesbian communities. I think there's more queer TERFs, if that makes sense, or gay TERFs or lesbian TERFs or whatever. Excuse me. Whereas gender critical feminists, I feel you see this much more around very mainstream feminist movements, especially in England. I think of it as something that sort of found its earliest traction in England, but that's also had this global influence. So you see people who identify as feminists all over the world who will criticize what they call gender ideology. So the idea that gender and sex are distinct experiences. And then finally, you have just people who are anti what they call gender ideology. So you have, and that runs the gamut from TERFs, like all the way over to like really, really right-wing politicians, activists, evangelical religious groups, stuff like that. So like, I think about like Viktor Orban, like, you know, the leader of Hungary is like someone who I would say is like very, very strongly sort of moving against and creating policy that's about like eradicating gender ideology. So the idea that that gender expression could be distinct from sort of the sexual organization of your body. So what your genitals look like.
What's the connection? Or should we take TERFs seriously?
So like yes and no. I have another yes and no. So on the no, I think that there's any merit in trying to distinguish between different kinds of womanhood, cisgender, transgender, non-binary, like any sort of iteration of womanhood. No, I definitely think that is like just a totally vacuous, disingenuous way of thinking about gender-based hierarchies. I don't think it's a way forward for like enacting feminist politics, for like finding a sort of route towards feminist liberation or various, you know, visions of feminist liberation. Yet, TERFs are nonetheless increasingly powerful. Do you know what I mean? Like there's more, we've really seen a lot of like TERF thinking, like so trans-exclusionary radical feminist thinking sort of ground itself in like powerful institutions, state legislatures, federal legislatures, university psychology departments, philosophy departments, sometimes women's studies departments. There is a Oxford University Press, which is an incredibly well-respected academic press, is publishing like an anthology. It's like, I think it's the first one that I've seen that's like called Gender Critical Feminism. Do you know what I mean? And so that's like a book that like is available to order, that you could, as a women's studies professor, order and teach in your class. And it has like the sort of imprimatur of Oxford University Press on it, which is like, again, this incredibly respected institution. So in that case, yeah, I think we should be taking them seriously because they pose a real threat to various ways of thinking about feminist justice that center the experience of trans and gender nonconforming people and understand like all of us to be united by the experience of gender disparities and gender-based oppression, you know? Yeah.
Well, I feel like we're right here. Like, what's the connection to fascism?
Well, I mean, and we are right here, and that's what's so terrifying. Well, I feel like, I think let's just also talk about what fascism means. And one of the things that was really fun about, fun is a weird way of talking about fascism, but one of the things that was really enjoyable about writing the introduction with Serena Bassi is my friend Serena is also my colleague. She's an Italian studies professor here at Yale. Serena is a scholar of fascism. So I'm not. Serena works on modern Italy, and also like is kind of like thinks about like global fascist movements. So I really learned a lot from Serena as we were working on this piece. Like I feel like the bulk of some of the connections to fascism were things that Serena wrote. But I don't think you actually need a theory of fascism to understand how like TERF and other forms of gender critical or like sort of anti-gender ideology end up in sort of right-wing or broadly fascist or authoritarian movements. So again, Hungary is a great example, although I don't want to point to Hungary and suggest that it is not happening in the United States, because it absolutely is. But I'll tell you, like, I'll talk about Hungary first. So Hungary is a really good example because Viktor Orban, who is, he started as this kind of populist leader. There's a good piece, I'm trying to remember what it was in. I want to say it was in the Atlantic, but maybe it was in the New Yorker. There's a good like profile of Viktor Orban that like if you're interested is definitely worth reading. So he started as this kind of populist like left-wing kind of thinker, ended up in power, didn't want to give up power, and like I feel like this is a trajectory we've seen a lot. Ended up basically like sort of like slowly and subtly changing things like election laws, gerrymandering, voting districts, such that basically it ensured that no one would get elected but him. Do you know what I mean? And it's just sort of been his sort of term. I mean, I don't know how he's been in power now. It's a long time. His term is like over the course of his leadership, he's become increasingly sort of authoritarian. And one of the ways that he's sort of tried to affect or like wrest control over the sort of organization of the state is through like gender and sexual politics. So there's like all these incentives around heterosexual marriage, for example. There's all of like a host of new laws and other forms of disenfranchisements around like having any sort of gender nonconforming identity, around like any sort of like homosexual status. I love saying homosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, whatever you are, queer. And so like, and I feel like this is one of the ways you kind of like, Hungary is a really good way, like good case for looking at it. That being said, here in the United States, you know, I think as I speak, if I might have the number wrong, but it's something like 17 or 18 states have pending legislation that that bars like anyone from offering gender affirming care to youth. We have the Don't Say Gay laws in Florida. One of the things that Florida introduced a bill, I think it's HB 999 just this week, I believe, that targets K through 12 institutions, but also state universities. Actually, it might just only target state universities, but that would ban gender studies as a major, that bans talking about gender or gender ideology. So I think, I mean, I feel like that's a really clear example of some of the sort of fascist tendencies. I mean, barring topics from being spoken about, I mean, that is like baldly authoritarian. You know what I mean? Like that's like right out of a fascist playbook. And also doing so in a sort of populist way. And I think we see this with like Rick DeSantis. We really saw this with Trump. That sort of imagines, that sort of creates a kind of like landscape of gender politics where it's like, well, we're the normals and we don't want the encroachment of the left telling us that we have a gender. Like we don't have a gender. We're just like regular folks working our regular jobs. Of course, it's not true. Everyone has a gender. Do you know what I mean? Like whether, or some people identify as agender. Some people would argue that that's a gender or not a gender, whatever. But like, you know, but gender experience is like, you know what I mean? Like women for Trump is a gender experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a lot. I've got a lot.
No.
Clearly.
Well, gosh, you know, it's hard. Can you talk a little bit about, because I know some people that identify as feminists or radical feminists kind of reject TERFs as feminists, or like they're not feminists.
Yes.
But there is a long history of feminists not being intersectional.
Indeed.
Or just being for themselves, in particular white feminists, just being for themselves.
Yeah. So this is actually the thing that I really wanted to get across. This was the part of the introduction that felt most important to me, is I see over and over again, like feminist people, queer people, people who are doing anti-racist work, like people who are doing anti-borders work, like people who are like generally broadly somewhere on the left, saying, well, like, we don't have to worry about TERFs, like we don't have to worry about trans exclusionary feminism because that's not feminism. And I see it from like some of the thinkers I like most respect and most admire and most like whose politics I feel like I've learned so much from. And this is just a moment where I think we all need to take a step back and like look at the history of feminist organizing in the United States and elsewhere, which has really been, especially in its sort of mainstream and most like legally entrenched versions, it's been very exclusionary. You know what I mean? And like, I think about, I mean, this is a much younger moment of my life, but I remember seeing an interview with Missy Elliott in maybe like, I don't know, like the early 2000s, some point. You know, I love Missy Elliott then and now. She said something in the interview where she was like, oh, I'm not a feminist. And I was like, what? Like, what? Like, I was just like horrified by this. But of course, like, you know, I do another few, years of work and, you know, reading and writing, as a white scholar. And I think that's the sort of critical term here. I'm reading about like what the history of exclusions within feminism, especially in the United States, have been. And it makes total sense to me why Missy Elliott would be like, I don't identify with feminism. Do you know what I mean? Which is not to say there aren't a ton of Black feminists who are like, yes, like feminism is my thing. But the sort of bind between especially sort of mainstream legislative feminism, what's often termed white feminism today, and like whiteness or the prerogatives of white people is a particularly like sort of strong history. And I feel like if we start there and we say, okay, we have this history of exclusions, we have like histories of feminists in the United States being like, yes, we should invade Afghanistan to like save the women there, you know, and I'm putting all of this around in very, very heavy quotes because this is incredibly specious. Like, you know, that's feminism, like working in the service of imperialism, right? And so I feel like when we start there and we look at that, of course, TERFs are feminists. You know what I mean? Like, it's just another iteration an oppressive kind of brand of feminism. And feminism has always been able to accommodate a kind of like various types of oppression. And I think that like when we hold that, I hope that it would like put pressure on those of us who are saying like, well, TERFs aren't feminists, like, because feminism can't brook transphobia. Feminism can absolutely brook transphobia, and that's part of the problems. And I think one of the things I've been really wrestling with as over the course of working on that special issue, but also over the course of like the last like 30 years of my life, is like feminism's ambivalent character. I think we want feminism to be good. We want feminism to be pure. We want it to be this thing that that we can hold on to as this like political good. And I mean, like most like sets of politics, it's not that. Do you know what I mean? We can make it that when we really try and when we constantly work at it. But like anything that is easily subsumable into sort of like corporate DEIA initiatives is probably a problem. You know what I mean? Including some types of feminism.
It is, I guess, I mean, I know there is no answer to like, what does it mean to push back against those fascist branches of something that has been so dear to so many people?
Yes. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's been kind of hard to address. You know what I mean? Because I think one of the reasons that it's been hard to address is that I think there's like a whole cadre of feminists, and I think there is a way that it does track with whiteness, and I 100% include myself in feeling this reticence, where like when you want something to be good, you don't want to look at it and be like, oh, this thing does harm, right? Like it's hard. We have an attachment. We have like emotional attachments to like political ideals. Like we have emotional attachments to people, and when you have feminism as a political ideal, especially if you're someone that you feel like feminism is served, and I certainly feel like I'm one of those people. And again, I don't think there's any way to think about that outside of like my own experience of whiteness. If you're one of those people that you feel like feminism has served you, like you invest even more. And I'm not giving up on feminism. I want to be very clear about that. Like I am a feminist. I believe that like righteous feminist politics is 100% like part of the way forward. But like I think that having like a very clear-eyed view of what the histories of feminism and presence is of feminism's exclusions are is the way there, is the way towards that sort of righteous iteration of feminist work.
Excellent. I wanted to ask you, gosh, there's a lot. I want to take a quick pivot to ask you about butches.
Oh yeah, let's talk about butches.
What of the butches? I heard recently a friend of mine is a professor, if you can believe that, and told me that her butch non-binary partner kind of almost had to start identifying as they, them in class so that students wouldn't think she was a TERF.
Yeah.
Which I never heard of, but this was a new, I mean, I was like, whoa, look at that. Whoa.
Grandma's on the phone. Yes. So I really oh man, I know I'm more like just trying to figure out how to like organize my thoughts around this. Let me just start by saying that's absolutely a real effect as like a butch identified person, but who also like who understands butchness as a form of gender nonconformity. And for me, like butchness is something that for me is on the trans spectrum. Do you know what I mean? Although that is also complicated because like not all trans people think of butchness but as like, butch experiences on the trans spectrum. But so I 100% that understand that feeling. Do you know what I mean? And there is a way that I do, and this is, the most generous read around my students and your friends' students perhaps too, is that like, they're really excited. They come to, especially like sort of gender studies classes, ethnic studies classes, American studies classes, like they come wanting the kind of grounded political education that they're like engaging in social media spaces that they want like depth in, they want to talk about it more, they're excited about it. But there is a way that I think because of like, and I feel like I'm like really just doing the middle-aged thing of like blaming social media. I'm like social media, but like, I think if we think about most media, not even just social media, most media like writ large is short form, right? Like Twitter is like whatever it is, 114 characters. Most, as someone who's like done public facing writing for like various like online and print fora, like it's rare that you're going to get more than like 2,500 words of space. And that's if you get a lot. Do you know what I mean? A lot of people want like 750 to 1,000 words. It's like they're all short forms. And when you're working in short forms, you're not really able to like get into the nuance and the nitty gritty and the complexity of a lot of these issues. And I think for a lot of my students, one of the things that I hammer all the time, and it's like a sort of prejudice is a weird word, but it's like a perception that they bring to the classroom. One of the things they bring to the classroom is the idea that all quote unquote second wave feminism was TERFy, which is profoundly not true. And you know, like I think like some of the earliest trans-centered feminism was from the quote unquote second wave. I also hate the idea of waves because I don't think they're that discontinuous, but I also don't think that they're so continuous that we could think of them as 1, 2, and 3 waves. But anyway, that's a separate question. So they'll come in and they'll be like, oh, like second wave feminists were TERFs. And I'm like, okay, first of all, there's about 60 billion varieties of what you were calling second wave feminism. I was earlier just today writing about like some of the earliest prison abolitionist feminisms from the 60s and 70s, for example. And that's something that I feel like doesn't get a lot of attention. So first of all, there's a million different varieties. And second of all, TERFs were actually in that moment an incredibly tiny, very loud minority, but incredibly small minority. But students come in with that perception and they want to feel like they have allies in the classroom, right? And so I really understand that perception. At the same time, I also will talk to my students, and I teach a trans studies class every year. And I always open it up by being like, look, we are going to be experiencing in this classroom micro-generational differences. Although now that I'm like 41, it's actually just like a generation. So maybe I'll have to start saying generational differences. But like, we're going to experience micro-generational differences. My experience of like what transness means, what gender nonconformity means, like what gender at all means is going to be different from yours. Many of yours will be different from each other. And like, we need to give each other grace in this moment and not assume that because something is different, that it's coming from, that the person is coming from a bad place. Like maybe it's just fucking different, you know? And I will tell my students that I am a butch identified person. And I do. And one of the things we start out with are some of like the earliest trans studies essays where people will constantly like give this like trans umbrella definition. Many people don't like the trans umbrella now, but it's useful to sort of bring students to. But butches are always on. Butches, queens, like you know, like you know, like all sorts of people sort of fall under the trans umbrella. And I think it's helpful to like bring them to that. And you know, there's a couple other essays that kind of also like theorize those intersections. But the other tricky thing, the other reason, if it's okay, am I going on too long?
Please, no, riff.
Okay. The other reason that they think this is because TERFs have also like taken up butches as these dying extinct communities of like dinosaurs that need to be saved. Do you know what I mean? So like there was that famous piece or this famous article from a few years ago where this like TERF, I'm trying to remember who it was. I cited in the footnotes to the article or to the introduction that Serena and I wrote, but where the person was like, well, I went to the coffee shop and I saw someone that would have been a butch in an early day, but who's now like a trans identified person. And this is butch genocide. And so this is actually to bring us back to the fascist stuff. What that person was riffing on is like far right wing and really actually alt-right like rhetoric of like white genocide, like the concern that like, and you see this around like anti-immigration rhetoric, all sorts of nativist like shit, where people will be like, white people are being taken over. I mean, of course it's trash. But again, you see the white genocide thing, and this person was riffing on that. And I just feel like in that moment, I'm like, oh yeah, like this TERF is, this is a white person. And I feel like, I just feel like you just can't take the politics of whiteness out of this. I'm like, you're sitting around at night and you're like reading TERF chat rooms and you're reading alt-right chat rooms. And you're like, both of these things are happening at the same time and they bleed into one another. And that's one of the reasons that I actually really insist on like talking to my students about like being a butch identified person is because I'm like there's no disappearance of butches. Do you know what I mean? There's like lots of different things that shape people's gender identifications at any given moment. And like, who knows, if I was born today, maybe I would identify differently, but I wasn't born today. I was born in 1981. So like, and that was the thing that sort of worked out for me. And I think, I mean, even when I hear people will casually be like, there's a butch shortage, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you're just not looking. Do you know what I mean? Like when I hear butch shortage, I'm like, your class politics are bad. Like, cause you're like only working in like you're only working in a particular like professional cross section where like gender looks differently. Do you know what I mean? But like butches are around. You just gotta like, you know what I mean? Look outside your like narrowly defined little geography to find them.
Yeah.
If when there's not butches there, but there's butches everywhere. Like I have like a million bitch colleagues. I don't know.
I mean, I remember J.K. Rowling kind of taking this up, being
Oh
like,
God.
I have a lesbian friend and she's butch.
I like, okay, also the straight TERFs need to fucking stop trying to save lesbians. Like, do you know what I mean? Like not only I'm actually gonna go ahead and like name this person. I have like a colleague in early American studies who's a historian named Anne Little, whose work in many ways I really like, but she kind of took this like, she all of a sudden started like got on this like TERF train, and she started tweeting things like, you know, I don't like accept trans women as women because I want to defend my lesbian friends. I'm like, fucking get away from me. Like, I don't need your fucking defense. Like, I'm very happy with my like trans dyke sisters, and like stay the fuck away from all of us, you know? So I don't know if I should have just shouted her out, but actually I'm fine with her shouting it out. So it's like there is that kind of like straight women like lesbian saviorship thing happening where I'm just like, you know nothing about lesbians. J.K. Rowling knows nothing about lesbians. Stay the fuck away from lesbians, and you know, let us sort of get together and like, you know, keep organizing in sort of anti-transphobic ways as most of us have for the better part of the last 50 years.
Also, who asked her?
Who the fuck asked her? Who asked her? Lesbians care about J.K. Rowling's for like feelings. No, none of us care.
No, I feel like she did a real, like, remember like Dave Chappelle was like, I've got one trans friend, don't give me a hard time. I feel like J.K. Rowling like went hunting for a lesbian and was like, like that person's like works for her or something. Was like doing the landscaping in her house. And then she was like, I have a very good lesbian friend.
It was definitely the landscaper. I'm glad that we identified that. It might have been the pool boy
or the dog walker.
It definitely could have been the dog walker. Perhaps her tennis pro. You know what I mean? There's a lot of different options.
No, but it's not one of her greatest pals. Her greatest trumps was like, JK, can I tell you the deepest problem that lesbians suffer in this day and age?
Yeah.
Other
trans just I know, it's just and it's so disingenuous, and I think that's the thing that just grosses me out so much. I'm like, don't pretend you care about lesbians. There's no lesbians in Harry Potter. I mean, there are, but they're not. Well, I think the divination professor, like, look at that, like, witchy ass lady.
Trelawney?
Like, no, the one who plays Emma.
Professor Trelawney.
Oh, that's her name.
With the big weird glasses.
Big weird glasses. Killed by Voldemort. You know what I mean? Eaten by the snake. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I hired her at one point when I like had a bad breakup and I needed like truth about the future, you know?
And she came and she saged you.
Yeah.
She
and
brought
she
her
own that exact same outfit.
She came to my house too, and she had a homemade maraca made out of bulb kelp.
Yeah.
That she found on the beach.
Yeah, she like went diving for it as part of her sort of sustainable kelp farming community that she's in.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
Yeah.
It was real space clearing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of J.K. Rowling, like I remember there was kind of this, I wonder if you can talk about the way that TERFs are kind of diverting from movements that empower and center Black lives. Like around Black Lives Matter, J.K. Rowling was like full force, full volume, talking about defending women at all costs.
Yes.
And that also kind of intersects with this TERFy sort of like female fragility, or woman, like the like vulnerability of women.
Yes.
And we have to protect women.
Oh God, yeah. This is like so important, because I also because I feel like you really see the prioritization of a particular type of like feminist politics in TERF work, where they're like, you know, there's danger in bathrooms, there's danger in stadiums, there's danger in women's prisons, but they don't mean because prisons themselves are dangerous, which they are. They mean that there's dangers of being like assaulted by like trans women, which is like the least of anyone who's ever been incarcerated like concerns. So like, I mean, so yeah, so there's this general investment, and I actually am literally writing a book about this right now, which is not the TSQ special issue. There's this general investment, and I think it's a very tracks very tightly with whiteness. Again, not exclusively. It also tracks with like class stuff, but like frequently whiteness and wealth obviously go together. So there's this real investment in like in asserting women, and by women I mean usually white, usually cisgender women's vulnerability, and especially vulnerability to sexual assault. Like the book I'm writing is about like the way that like politics around sexual assault have been used by feminists to like really affect all these sorts of like nefarious ends, including things like carceral feminism, you know, like incarceration, the expansion of the criminal law, et cetera. But there's this real, but I think one of the reasons that there is such an investment in this kind of like politics of danger is because it's very politically powerful. Do you know what I mean? When you say like, well, like, is your wife going to be safe in a public bathroom in North Carolina? People are like, oh God, like, is my wife going to be safe in a public bathroom in North Carolina? And like, you know, there's something very compelling about danger. And there's also, I think there's a way that insisting on one's harmability, it's a way, and like how to say this in a way that's like not something I disagree with. Let me think about this. Like under patriarchy, I think that most feminine people, or people who've had experience of being feminized, and then that, you know, that cuts across like literally like 75% of people at least. Most people who have the experience of like femininity or being feminized or being perceived as feminine understand there is danger in that, right? Like I'm not saying that there isn't like a kind of organization of social violence that does target femininity of all shapes and sizes, and like that, again, that's racialized, it's classed, it's like also there's all sorts of like little permutations of that. And I think that because so many people recognize this, when you have these like white women, especially those in like powerful positions or who have a lot of cultural capital, like for example J.K. Rowling, being like, we need to organize as women because like we are in danger, that does speak to people, right? Like people are like, yeah, like I know the experience of that because of, you know, X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. The thing is, when people start organizing around that, usually it's like only protecting like a really like the focus is on like a really narrow like sort of cohort of people. And in this case, cisgender women, right? Often girls are invoked, right? I don't know if you saw Abigail Schreier's terrible book called hold on, the subtitle is the transgender craze seducing our daughters, but like it's got this horrible cover where it's like a 1950s like paper doll, but like her junk is cut out. There's just like an empty hole where her junk used to be. Sorry, I mean, I love the drama of it, like as a Leo, like yeah, just go there. Like whoever designed that cover, I'm like can you design my next book cover, just not make it TERFy? But you know, so I think that speaks to a lot of people. And again, there's like a lot of emphasis on the sexual vulnerability of women and girls, and generally what that's meant is like white people or people with like various types of institutional access. Do you know what I mean? Like there's not and you'll see people like J.K. Rowling, among other people, will toss around issues of like safety for like cisgender women in prison or cisgender women in homeless shelters. And I'm like, you know, maybe the bigger problems affecting like a much larger cross section of people, including trans and cis women, is incarceration, is like not having access to secure housing, right? But of course they don't want to do that because like that kind of structural critique, in that you lose your commitment to TERFism and it becomes like economic and racial, and they don't want to focus on that stuff. You know what I mean? And I think like the most engagement that I've seen with a lot of TERFs around stuff, around the Black Lives Matter movement, around various types of like anti-racist feminisms, have been like really trying to think like narrowly about particular what they think of as like women's issues, which like sometimes comes down to like is often like limited to sort of reproductive rights, but they don't even want to think about the kinds of like reproductive justice issues that really disproportionately affect women of color. You know, so it's just like, or people of color, and often gestational parents, women and gestational parents of color. And yeah, I'm rambling a bit, but like, yeah, there's just, you scratch the surface of the sort of rhetoric of like racial justice in TERF movements and it disappears. There's nothing there. You know what I mean? There's no there.
Today's episode is brought to you by Jenna Luna, Cale McHurst, Maura Bainbridge, Colleen Garland, and Joey Soloway. If you would like to support Sagittarian Matters, in particular producer Chris Sutton, please send $5, $5 million, $15, $15 million, that's your business, via PayPal to hornetleg@gmail.com. Or, this just in, he's got a Venmo. Hell Books, that's HE double hockey sticks books on Venmo. Thank you for your support, and we look forward to saying your name on the podcast. Producer Ponyo looks forward to it too. Don't be scared. That's just Ponyo's speaking voice.
I don't know if you feel like you've covered this, but I want to know, how does the rise of TERF, how does it actually benefit fascists?
Oh my God.
Or fascism.
Yeah. So, here, so I think there's a couple different ways. So number one, I think that gender as an idea, gets rolled into a sort of political package. It's like I'm thinking about the 2008 financial crisis. It's like a tranche in like one of those like shares that everyone was buying and selling that eventually crashed the economy. But like gender as a set of politics, and gender identification as a set of politics, I think it gets sort of rolled in with things like very like larger LGBT politics. So like everything from like gay marriage to like decriminalization of particular sexual acts or decriminalization of particular acts in particular places. So I think it gets rolled into that set of politics such that it's easier for them to be like sort of out of hand rejected. And generally, like if you think about what a lot of trans activists are doing right now, which are like often calling for economic, like, you know, sort of like reforms and or abolition of like oppressive economic structures, oppressive state structures like policing. Like the state is really invested in things like capitalism. The state is really invested in things like incarceration. The state is really invested in like maintaining that kind of control, and those things are institutions of control. So part of that is like, you know, like it's actually like kind of a rejection of other sets of politics. But then also and sort of more importantly, like if you think about fascism almost always has a race politics to it. Do you know what I mean? Like find me a fascism that didn't have some sort of like very strong Foucault had a word for this and I'm blanking. State racism that doesn't have like a state racism to it. Like I'll buy you dinner, but I'm like I can't think of any fascist sort of program that has not. And even whether that's about like prioritizing white over black and brown, or whether that's about prioritizing Hungarians over anyone who's not from Hungary, or prioritizing some sort of like myth of like an originary civilization over like the, you know, sort of over like people who are migrating, you know, over migrants or immigration, or people who are coming in bringing different sort of cultural protocols to a place. Like every sort of fascism, every form of fascism has this sort of racial politics to it. And if you want to sort of shore up a racial hierarchy, you can't do it without a very sort of conservative understanding of like gendered and sexual social organization. Do you know what I mean? Because like you have to incentivize people to sort of only sort of stick with their same racial, ethnic, you know, cultural groups. You need a strong sort of conservative vision of like families, because like family organization is like, of course, as we know from all these materialist feminists, it's social organization. It's the way that your ideology is going to be passed down from generation to generation. I mean, there's a very strong need for a really conservative gender and sexual politics for fascism to actually flourish. And if you look at some of the essays at the end of the TSQ, the Trans Studies Quarterly special issue that Serena and I did, there's a really good piece that Sophie Lewis and Asa Saracen wrote on the way that like women's empowerment was built into like early 20th century fascist movements, including National Socialism, Nazism. And you really just see, you're like, oh wow, like fascism wants women to it wants to sort of use a particular vision of the empowerment of women to sort of achieve its various kind of like conservative gender and sexual ends. I don't know if that's too vague.
I think it's too vague.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's interesting to think about the incentivizing of sticking with your group.
Yeah.
And I mean, it takes me back to feeling like maybe being a million years old, being like, with the internet, with whatever, like it's really like it's nothing but giving you the opportunity to be in a micro group, like a microclimate of your exact views, and then maybe some different, but not really, it's not as weird.
Yeah.
As even if you just had a normal job where you had to go somewhere and hang out with other people that you never would have known.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it too, right? Like if you're invested in like a high degree of social control, as most fascists are, you don't want your like, whatever community, whatever cultural community that you're prioritizing, say Christians, right? You don't want your Christian workers, your Christian families, etc., to go hang out with like whatever the deprioritized religion is, right? Which in like Hungary is like both Islam, Judaism. I think it's like everything else other than Christianity. But I mean, but I don't mean to scapegoat Hungary here. Let's just use the United States. Like you don't want. There's a reason that like to sort of change the context. There's a reason that like Rick DeSantis and others like don't want people to say gay in K through 12 classrooms, right? Like that degree of control, you want to like limit what people are exposed to. Like on the cover of the New Yorker this week, there's like I don't know if you saw it. There's like a cartoon of DeSantis like sharpening his knives, and like on front of him is like a pile of books, you know what I mean, because like of all the book bans in K through 12 libraries. Like you want to limit people's access to information, and sometimes people and communities are other information, right? Like the more sort of hermetic you can make people's experiences of their communities, the more you can sort of shore up hierarchies of like, who's going to get the state resources and who's going to be deprioritized and found to be disposable.
Whoa. Greta, what else?
Man,
what did I not ask you that you feel like is important to add to this conversation? I mean, I know in the TSQ, they also was like the links between TERFs and Zionism. So I don't even understand. I didn't even read that part.
That's a really good essay, and actually that's like that's kind of about like OG TERFs, because that's by Heike Schotten, and she looks at like these early Zionist movements among lesbian feminists in the Bay Area, and sort of traces like out of their newsletters. So this is from like the 70s, and maybe even the late 60s. I'd have to go back and look at the article, but traces the way that you see this like burgeoning conversation that's targeting trans women, like in these specifically Zionist newspapers, or newsletters that are for like lesbian feminists, Jewish lesbian feminists. And it's just kind of wild. Like, why? You know what I mean? But Heike Schotten has a theory of why. And yeah, I mean, there's so much in there. There's also one of the other pieces I really like is this piece. Hold on, by Jenny Evange. I've actually never met this person, so I don't know how to say their last name. I'm going to say Evange, Evang. And that person writes about the way that like TERFs increasingly use like the sort of like rhetoric of like post-colonial and like anti-colonial rhetoric to make arguments about why gender ideology is a bad thing. They're like gender ideology, and this is like I'm parroting TERFs here. Gender ideology is something that's imported from the West, and like the real authentic experience of gender in whatever, like wherever it is we are, say France, like Nigeria, China, whatever, that's some sort of Western import, and it's like an iteration of like cultural imperialism that's trying to unseat our like really important like sort of cultural ways of understanding gender in particular, but gender and sexual politics more broadly. And it's true, you really see that all over the place, where people will be like, how dare you impose your transgender ideology on like, you know what I mean, women in India. And you're like, actually, and there's been tons and tons of scholarship on like the not million is a little extreme, but like the many different words, frameworks that exist in like, India is a place with like so many languages, right? That exist in like all these different languages and all these different communities and all these different parts of the country for talking about gender nonconforming experience, identity. Some of those people will also, and communities will also use the term transgender when they do things like speak to the state. Do you know what I mean? Some people will refuse them, but it's a very mixy conversation that like TERFs would want to see flattened into like some sort of straight Western imperialism equals transgender identity equals oppression of like sort of local ways of understanding gender and sexuality, and thus we should reject it all. But it's like so disingenuous. It's so shitty.
What's the point?
Well, I'm also
What's
like,
the point?
I'm also like, a lot of people have access to the internet. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, there's like it's not just like, you know, that like some American is getting off a plane somewhere. I mean, and also not to excuse Americans. Like we've done horribly like and we have done and continue to do horribly like, you know, imperial things, and cultural imperialism is a problem, right?
Yeah.
But like TERFs are like using it to sort of refuse the reality of people who are like openly saying, I don't identify with like these conventional ways of understanding gender, whatever they are in that person's like place. And it's a mess. It's a mess.
It is a mess. Well, do you have any glimmers of hope? Is there anything that keeps you going? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think about like my friends who are like, you know, at this point, like who have been doing activist work for like decades. And I, you know, like the mantra that like, you need to believe that you'll win, you know what I mean? Like, and I think I've really internalized that. Like, I believe that we'll win. And I do think that there's a way that like, whether people like it or not, that people, gender nonconforming people, trans people, non-binary people who don't sort of like walk easily in step with like whatever the sort of conventional gender common sense of like their place and their like their everyday lives, they're really like unsettling. And I mean, also I don't know why I'm talking about myself like I'm not third every time I go and order coffee. But like I feel like we've like really like we're unsettling normative ways of doing gender too. You know what I mean? Like I have so many like cis masculine or cis like men identified students now, for example, who will like wear dresses to class and who will like, do you know what I mean? Who like talk about their feelings. Like I had a student in a class like the last time I taught a trans studies class, and we were talking about violence, like talk about his own experience of sexual assault. And like I was like, wow, that's the first time I've heard like a cis man identified person talk about, and a straight cis man identified person, I should mention, like just sort of openly talk about sexual assault. And I'm like, that is the payoff of like feminist work. Do you know what I mean? When everyone, no, which is not to say it's the only payoff, but like it's one of the payoffs. And I just feel like the like sort of ripples from this work are felt all over the place, in all different sort of corners of like people's everyday lives, such that like I think it's like kind of too big to stop, if that makes sense. Like, and I'm not saying there's problematic trans politics all over the place. Like, do you know what I mean? It's not like I agree with like every iteration of like what some people I imagine to be a sort of transgender political left. But at the same time, I feel like what's going on is broadly good. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think there would be as much, for example, state legislation happening trying to ban gender affirming care for kids if there wasn't like, if people weren't aware and kind of scared of like the reality of like a sort of like changing cultural consensus around what gender is, you know, what gender difference is. So I feel optimistic, but I'm generally optimistic. So I don't know, maybe ask someone who's like a downer.
No, I just wanted to thank you for having a little. I mean, that was you know, just a side note. I don't even know if you had a nugget of hope, or if you were just like, no, I'm just stewing in the pain. I mean,
of reality. Sometimes I do think. I mean, I feel a little bit more pessimistic about like sort of the swing left of like world politics, or excuse me, the swing left. I don't feel worried about that. I wish I felt worried. It's not that I wish I felt worried. Anyway, but the swing right of global politics, or of like politics on a global scale, like, do you know what I mean? Like Brazil, India, the United States, Canada, England, like, you know, it's everywhere. And it's that shit scares me. You know what I mean? That I feel a little bit less optimistic about. And what I just said about my optimism around like around trans-centered feminist politics is maybe like a little bit in contradiction with what I just said about like my concern about like global right-wing politics, because global right-wing politics have really increasingly picked up transphobia basically as something that like that sort of that they find fuel in, you know, that fuels their acceleration. But yeah, oh yeah, and I did want to add, that's the other reason that like fascism that fascism like uses transphobia is because there is still a lot of transphobia, right? Like, so like transphobia is like a really easy, it's kind of like it's not even a dog whistle. It's just like a straight up like gym class whistle that brings all these people who are like, I don't know about that. Like, you know, the idea, people are very committed to a sharp distinction between men and women. I mean, it's like a story that like, I don't know how many people, at least in my life, have like been able in any way to escape that from like the literal day they were born. You know what I mean? Like Butler's like famous example is like, you're born and the first thing people says is like, it's a boy, it's a girl. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's so strong. And so I think transphobia is equally strong. You know what I mean? When people transgress gendered norms. And so it's a really easy way to be like, you know what, do you want your son to become a daughter? If not, then vote for me. You know, and a lot of people are like, no, I don't. Oh God.
What does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean? Like, you know.
Can I ask you lastly, how do you feel about the word dyke?
I love the word dyke. Oh, I love the word dyke. I think I think this is why I won't say, I do use, sorry, I'm backing up to go back to your friend who's like, I feel compelled to use they them pronouns in class. I understand that pressure, and I do feel I have started using like putting like she or they on my stuff, and I have always responded to they, right? And I think they, to quote Susan Stryker, who's incidentally the founder and one of the first managing editors of Trans Studies Quarterly, but who has since stepped down as she sort of moves into new projects. But Susan likes to say, I've heard her say several times that like in her perfect world, like they would be the sort of like the what's it called? Like the formal, do you know what I mean? So like, until you know someone's gender situation, you just use they for everyone. And then when you know them, you use whatever pronoun that they want. But there's like a general they that's like someone referring to someone as like doctor instead of like their first name. You know what I mean? But yeah, so I use she or they now, but sorry, I've now completely lost the thread. So dyke. But I bring like I really try to insist to my students on like the usefulness of words like dyke, like lesbian, like butch, like whatever other words, because there is a way that like students, at least, and I'm just speaking from my own experience right now, they'll be more comfortable with like masculine words than they will with feminine words. Like feminine words carry, or I mean, not to say that I think of dyke is necessarily a feminine word, but it's not necessarily not either. But like, you know, that like we'll say you guys and no one has a problem with it. But you know what I mean? But I like to say like, hey, gender free sisters, because like, because I think it like emphasizes the way that like any sort of feminine word seems to carry more gender with it. And yeah, so I love the word dyke, and I think dyke describes all sorts of positions, all sorts of gender experiences. I don't think like dyke is feminine or masculine or whatever. I know trans dykes, cis dykes, non-binary dykes. So like,
it's fun to say.
It's fun to say. It's a great
listeners
word.
try it.
Yeah,
if you're not at work.
Just say I'm a dyke. I'm a dyke.
Just by yourself in your car. Just say.
Yeah, just say I'm a dyke. Like, just feel the power. It feels good. Feels good.
Well, someday I'll have you on the show to talk about femininity and talking about gender and the inherent, like, people really love getting drawn to the masculinity.
They really do, and it's just so it's not whatever. It's not sad if that's your experience. Do your thing, but like but people are still, and queer people are as guilty, if not guiltier than about this than other people than like non-queer people. There's just a way that like people imagine masculinity or things that code as masculine to be the equivalent of a lack of gender. So like when people reach for androgyny, they often reach for something that looks like, in a sort of generic social way, like masculinity. And I'm kind of like, guys, like, I mean, if that's your truth, live your truth. But at the same time, like, there's all sorts of like really amazing things about femininity too. And I don't think it is unrelated to latent misogyny that like the landscape of that is what it is.
Yeah, I agree.
So
it's been in my pocket for a long time.
Oh yeah. Well, let's like let several years transpire, and then we'll forget that we did this, and then we'll do another interview about that later.
Good. I mean, I was just talking to a senior neighbor who mentioned a story he had mentioned before. And I didn't really, I don't mind, just say it. And then he was like, he had a pause, and he was like, I've told you that story before. And I was like, you have? And he was like, darn it. But I think that's what the podcast is going to be as time goes on. But every time I'm just like, tell me again.
Yeah, no, I'm here for it. I'll interview you next time, and we'll just do a little switcheroo.
We'll do a switcheroo. Yeah, just start thinking of questions now.
All right,
And maybe I'll just tell you the same things you just told me, but I'll have no remembering.
I'll be like, it'll be fresh. It'll be like it's never happened. I'll be like, wow, I got to write this down. Maybe I should write something for TSQ.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, as always.
Sagittarian Matters is produced by Chris Sutton, with assistance by Panyo Georges. Our theme music is composed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs of the band Bouquet. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.